Still probably a little too much. How about that? Good to go? Outstanding. Oh, great. Well, good morning, friends. How is everybody doing today? Can I be heard adequately? Yes? Great. They are feeling social today, aren't they? I kind of want to let it go. I believe we're up to chapter 8 today. Flying through. Actually, today, slow down. I hesitate to say anything, but I feel like today we're going to get through a lot. Yeah, because I think we're going to take some big chunks. Sometimes it's every verse, sometimes it's every word, and sometimes it's like, let's take a paragraph. Yeah. And this is one of those ones, especially because I think sometimes when we deal with translation is an issue. Also, when we deal with like ancient texts, I think sometimes things that might have been obvious to the initial readers may not be so obvious to us. I was thinking about this. I've thought about this a few times over the years. Sarcasm, right? We use sarcasm, no problem, and we all kind of know when it's happening usually, right? And it's no big deal. But if in, let's say, 1,000 years, somebody dug up a note that you wrote that was dripping with sarcasm, would they know that? So I think sometimes the context, I'll just share with you some other difficulties of particularly reading the Hebrew. There's no capitalization. There's really no punctuation, and there's not even really spaces. This is true of ancient Greek as well. Generally speaking, you just run capital letters all up against each other, and that's what it is. And then you get things like ands. In Greek, you get a lot of the word kai, which you can loosely translate as and. Really, it means just sort of like generic conjunction or like continuation of thought. And in Hebrew you get it's just a one letter, it's a waw or a vav depending on who taught you how to read Hebrew. Some people do a W, some people do a V, but it's just a wa, and it sort of marks that like you started another thing in a sequence. So you do get some little bits of little hints that things are like a question, for instance. I have a name that is a rhetorical question in Hebrew. Did you know that? No. Not many people have a rhetorical question for a name. I do. Mikael, right, Michael? Mikael, three particles to that. Who is like God? Ka means like. Sometimes when you're down at, what's the name of that Christian bookstore over in, it's over next to Hobby Lobby. Mardell's, yeah. And you're looking at like the bookmarks with people's biblical names and it says what they mean. I'm not saying at Mardell's in particular, but a lot of times when you're in these places and you find it, it'll say godlike. No, that's not what Michael means. It means who is like God. It's a rhetorical question. And what's the answer that should come to mind?
God, only God.
Yes, no one else. There is only God who is like God. Okay. So anyways, my name is a testimony, which I think is cool. The breakdown there is El is a short of Elohim, which is the word for God, El. Anytime you hear those biblical names ending in L, usually their name means something about God. Israel means wrestles with God or struggles with God. And he got that name after he wrestled with an angel, right? He was Jacob before that. Ka means like, so we got like God. Me, when you see it, it's a question word. And in this case, it means who. I'm saying all that to set you up for what's about to come in chapter 8. Because if you read verses 2 through 8 without the context of the rest of the book, it would have a very clear and easy to digest message. But I don't think that 2 to 8 he's actually making the point. I think 2 to 8 he's laying out a case. So we'll read it, we'll talk about it. But like I said, we're going to take it as a chunk, because I think if you just try and take it line by line and then just apply it directly to your life line by line, actually we might be missing the forest for the trees in this case. So let's do a quick summary review as we always do. We are reading through the book of Ecclesiastes, and it is a book written by whom? Solomon, right? When in his life is this happening? Later, yeah, he's an older man. He's had time to reflect upon life. Tell me a little bit about his life up till now. Where did he start? Who is his dad? Let's start with that. David, right? The second king of Israel, the first, good one, right? Because before him was Saul, who was a coward and had big emotional swings, paranoid, not really a man of faith terribly. David comes after him, and he's a man of exceptional character, but he does have a downfall. He does have a moral failing, which leads him into conspiracy to murder, basically. And that failing is adultery, right? So that was a lesson that his sons could have learned from. So Solomon is born, the son of David. There are other sons, but Solomon is the one that becomes king. And before he becomes king, he has a heart-to-heart with God. And God says to him, ask. Whatever you want, I'll give it to you. What does Solomon ask for? Wisdom. And God says, look at you. You didn't ask for long life. You didn't ask for wealth. You asked for wisdom. And why did he ask for wisdom? Because he says it in the prayer. Do you remember?
So he can rule the people?
Yes. He's in a humble place. I'm about to become king. I know I'm not up to the task. So, Lord, he says, this burden is too heavy for me. So make me wise, that I can be a good king. And God says, that's a good answer. You know what? In fact, because you've asked for wisdom, not long life, not riches, I'll give you both and wisdom to boot. You'll be the wisest man that ever lived. Solomon builds a temple for the Lord, something that his father David wanted to do, but God said, no, you're not the right guy, but I will give that honor to your son. Builds a temple. And then what happens to the nation under Solomon's rule?
Does well.
It prospers, right? They're triumphant in all of their battles, right? This is a trap. Yeah, they're not having wars. The nations are already just bringing homage. And people come to Solomon's court to watch him do the king thing. He's a phenomenon. So he's famous, he's wise, he's rich, he's prosperous. And he gets, I don't know how to say this properly, given many women to be his brides. Or not brides, just roommates. Yeah. And so Scripture says that he married 700 women and had 300 other women. That 2 is too many. I'm just going to tell you, 2 is too many. You're not going to find any story of polygamy in the Bible where it doesn't cause massive issues in the family. Well, that in itself may not be directly what would be considered his downfall. It is, but the reason it becomes so much so is that the man who was given the honor of building the temple to the Lord, a temple that was meant to be for all nations, this is in the prayer of dedication, that all nations would come to that temple, and when they pray toward the Lord, he would hear their prayers too, right? So he's this beacon to all the nations. They're supposed to be attracted to Israel and drawn to worship the God of Israel. But what happens instead is these women who have their own gods, he accommodates for them. He starts building them sites of worship for their own pagan gods. What we don't necessarily read in the narratives of Solomon's life, you can read them in between the lines, but we get it explicitly in this book, which is that Solomon, as he's progressing, as he's rising in wealth, as he's rising in power, as he's rising in fame and prominence, what condition is his heart in? Conflicted? Other thoughts? When you read through Ecclesiastes, how is Solomon feeling?
Well, it seems like he's starting to get discouraged, kind of like looking at his life and saying, oh, this is not. But at the same time, he has this paradoxical faith in God that says, you know what?
Yeah.
Is out there.
I'm not a psychologist or psychiatrist, but my armchair diagnosis is Solomon is deeply depressed and hopeless and wrestling with that and trying to remember his God and trying to find relief from that hopelessness in the hope of God. But as long as he keeps his head down and is looking at what the world has to offer, he's a wreck. He says, I sought wisdom. And you know what I found? Misery and emptiness. So I sought wealth. And you know what I found? You can't keep it with you. You can't take it with you. And it's all meaningless. So I sought pleasure, best foods, the best experiences. And you know what? It was all hollow and never enough. So I tried to make a difference. I built gardens and pools and things that would leave a legacy, and fine, but it doesn't fill me. And so a few times throughout this book, we've heard this refrain of a couple refrains. One is, I looked at everything under the sun and I saw that it was all meaningless. It was vanity. It was chasing after the wind. What's that? Hovel. Yeah. But then, sometimes, he says, what I've realized is the best thing you can do is live your life with gratitude from God, with gratitude toward God for all that he's given you, because whatever you have comes from him. And if you can just receive what you have as coming from his hand, then you'll have joy and you'll sleep at night and you'll wake up and life will have meaning. So he's going back and forth. You said conflicted when I said, how is he feeling, right? And again, so I think we're going to see that in this section coming up. Last week we talked a little bit about transcendence, that this is the wisest man who ever lived, and yet he says, I can't find wisdom. It's just outside my grasp. I know it's out there, and I can't seem to get a hold of it. So we talked a little bit about absolute truth and relative truth, right? That the thing that people will say these days where they're like, well, let me tell you my truth. And then they expect you to accept that as if it's just reality. And what you can do is say, well, I accept that that's your experience. But you, like me, we all have a limited perspective and a limited ability to understand. And Solomon, the wisest who ever lived, he knew that he couldn't grasp truth with his faculties. So I'm going to have the humility to say that I'm not going to either. Does that mean that we can never know the truth? Does anybody know the truth?
Ultimately, the truth appears in one person, God himself in Christ.
Yeah, Jesus is the truth. God, who sees it all as it is, he knows the truth. And so the truth that you can rely on is what he says. And whatever he says, that's truth. And so when my experience contradicts with his truth, well then, maybe it's me that needs to bend or re-examine or think through. It's not him that's going to change, it's me. Okay. Ecclesiastes chapter 8. Who is like the wise? Who knows the explanation of things? A person's wisdom brightens their face and changes its hard appearance. Really? I thought that Solomon said that wisdom brings misery. And he couldn't decide whether it was better to be blissfully ignorant or wise with all the bitterness that entails.
What does he mean by interpretation of things?
Proper understanding. You know, seeing a thing for what it is and understanding what it is.
So is he suggesting here that this is a person whose face looks like somebody that just solved the Rubik's Cube or solved the problem, right? It's like...
Yeah. It's that eureka moment,
Yeah.
right? And yeah, I think so. And if we're to take these verses at face value, which is probably a good way to start, then I think this all lands where we left off last week, which is to say, you don't know the truth, but if God reveals a truth to you, how glad will it make you? So we do have this contrast of his personal quest for wisdom that ended in folly and the revelation of God that brings joy. It could be that. Or it could be, because we're going to read this next session, I think what you're going to hear in these next verses is worldly wisdom. And we shouldn't reject worldly wisdom out of hand. If you read the book of Proverbs, it's full of, this is the way things work. Do this and this will be your outcome. So we shouldn't reject worldly wisdom out of hand, but we do need to hold it up against the wisdom of God. So let's read this big chunk here from 2 to verse 8. Obey the king's command, I say, because you took an oath before God. Do not be in a hurry to leave the king's presence. Do not stand up for a bad cause, for he will do whatever he pleases. Since a king's word is supreme, who can say to him, what are you doing? All right, let's pause on that for a minute. Who's the king in Israel right now? Solomon is. So it seems a little self-serving, right? To be like, hey, obey the king. Do what I say. But maybe we should take this in the abstract a little bit. Maybe he's not just talking about him personally, right? Maybe he's talking about when you're working with a king, which we don't in America, but we do have authorities, right? Do what they say. Why? Verse 2, why? What does your translation say?
Mine says God's oath to him, because of God's oath to him.
Interesting. What does your translation say?
Same thing,
Okay.
because you took an oath before God.
Yeah, you have the ESV? Yeah.
No, I have NIV.
You have NIV, and you have ESV?
Mhm.
Got it. Yeah, so this is one of those places where the translation's a little bit ambiguous, and the way you translate it's going to make a difference in the interpretation. So what I have here is, because you took an oath before God, which seems to be, if that's the proper translation, obey the king because you were sworn into duty to do so, right? If we take the ESV instead, it would seem to be because God put him in his position, right? And both of those are perfectly valid interpretations, perfectly biblical ideas. Let's keep going. Okay, so obey the king because that's your vocation, right? That's your calling. Do not be in a hurry to leave the king's presence. Do not stand up for a bad cause, for he will do whatever he pleases. So, I'm not sure that this is bad in the moral sense. I think this might be careful what hill you choose to die on, right? Some people just like to pick fights. Some people like to find faults. And I think Solomon's warning here is, when you deal with a king and you're going to stand up, make sure you're standing up for a good cause. Because if you do this frivolously, it's not going to go well for you. Because he will do whatever he pleases, right? He's not beholden to you. You're beholden to him. So if you're going to make a stand, double check your motives and double check that this is the thing that's worth making a stand over. Because you might not survive it. Since the king's word is supreme, who can say to him, "What are you doing?" Now, I will pause you there for a second. Is the king's word supreme? Here in church, I ask.
God's word is supreme over him.
So who can say, "What are you doing?"
God.
God. This actually happened to David. When the business with Bathsheba and Uriah went down, the prophet Nathan, I believe, came in and confronted him and basically told him, you wouldn't put up with a sort of injustice if somebody had mistreated their livestock, and yet you've done this with a man's wife. So yeah, that's why I'm saying, like, I think that what's being presented here is meant to be sort of the worldly wisdom, and it's true. You can put it into practice, but I think there's a higher wisdom. So let's keep going. Whoever obeys his command will come to no harm, and the wise heart will know the proper time and procedure. So let's pause on that for a real quick second. Will know the proper time and procedure. Now that might be about carrying out the king's command the proper way, but I think it also might be the proper way to raise an objection, right? Like, sometimes maybe you're in a meeting, maybe you're in a public setting, whatever, and an issue comes up, and you know it needs to be dealt with. But maybe, if you're wise, you might ask yourself, yes, but is this the moment? Is this the setting that needs to be dealt with? Maybe it is, but maybe it's not. Maybe we can have a private conversation later. For there is a proper time and procedure for every matter, though a person may be weighed down by misery. All right, that's more of the same. Let's keep going. Since no one knows the future, who can tell someone else what is to come? Again, this seems a little bit ironic from the guy who's like, there is no new thing under the sun. A couple weeks ago, I asked you, who can tell the future? Everybody and nobody, right? As no one has power over the wind to contain it, so no one has power over the time of their death. and so no one is discharged in time of war. So wickedness will not release those who practice it. All right, so again, we're still keeping that under the sun perspective on things, and it's not wrong exactly, but it might not be complete either. You're hearing him talk a lot about, and he will continue to in the next chapter or two, he'll talk about the finality of death in a way that as a Christian actually doesn't sit right with me, right? But it's important to remember that distinction throughout the book of everything under the sun. And when he gets those moments to look up beyond the horizon. All right, so no one has power over the wind to contain it, so no one has power over the time of their death. I mean, that's a good word for anybody. Wickedness will not release those who practice it. So another way of restating that is, look, dude, being unrighteous is never a real escape. And we talked about this last week, I think, or the week before that wickedness is always foolishness. It just might not look like it in the moment. It might look wise. It might look clever or savvy. But on balance, wickedness is always foolishness. So he's saying here, look, if you think you have a way out through wickedness, maybe go back and rethink. If the thing needs doing, there's a proper way, a proper procedure. So the means matter just like the ends matter. They both matter. Okay. So he's saying all this stuff. Obey the king. Here's how you ought to operate with the king. Here's how things go down in the court. But then listen to this. Verse 9. All this I saw as I applied my mind to everything under the sun. There is a time when a man lords it over others to his own hurt. A couple verses earlier, the king says, obey the king. And now the king says, there's a time when a man lords it over others to his own hurt. Then too I saw the wicked buried, those who used to come and go from the holy place and receive praise in the city where they did this. This too is meaningless. When the sentence for a crime is not quickly carried out, people's hearts are filled with schemes to do wrong. Now, I'll just take a moment on this. This isn't big picture of the book stuff, but it is a bit of wisdom worth knowing. As a Lutheran church, we have this cool, I think it's cool and very helpful teaching about the two kingdoms of which God is king. There's the left-hand kingdom and the right-hand kingdom. And Christians live in both. The left-hand kingdom is the civil realm, the worldly system, right? God is sovereign over the world. The right-hand kingdom is basically the church, right? And they operate in different ways. So the church primarily operates through grace. And when sin is presented in the kingdom of the right hand, it's met with grace. But in the left hand, oftentimes there needs to be punishment as well. And sometimes Christians who don't understand that God can be sovereign in both ways and both are necessary will opt for mercy when mercy is not the right thing. So what Solomon's saying here is, look, if you don't enforce the law, more lawlessness will happen. If you're slow to mete out justice, expect more injustice to happen. Because people look around and they go, well, he got away with it. I guess I could get away with it too. And this comes from him watching the wicked prosper, right? It's like, well, why are the wicked prospering? Well, nobody put a stop to it. Who should have put a stop to it? Who should have put a stop to it? Solomon should have. All right. Although a wicked person who commits 100 crimes may live a long time, I know that it will go better with those who fear God and are reverent before him. Yet because the wicked do not fear God, it will not go well with them, and their days will not lengthen like a shadow. Again, this seems, if you have only the under the sun perspective, this seems to be contradictory. What do you mean, if the wicked live for 100 years, if they live, somebody who commits 100 crimes lives a long time, yet their days won't lengthen like a shadow? Well, let's take those a bit at a time. So, verse 12, he says, if you commit a crime and live a nice long life, that's not better than the alternative. He doesn't spell it out all the way, but he implies it, right? I know that it will go better for those who fear God, who are reverent before him. Are they going to live a long life? Maybe. Maybe not. Worth noting, by the way, how many commandments do we usually count? 10 commandments, right? How many of those have a promised benefit for obedience? Just one. It's honor your father and mother, that it may go well with you and you may live long in the land. Just saying. When your mom says, I brought you into this world and I can take you out, that's...
You want me to go get Sam so you can go over that part again? Or?
Dude, he's not worried about living a long life right now. That's not on the horizon for him.
Can I ask a question? This visual about the shadow getting longer. Is the idea that as the sun is setting on your life, that your shadow goes to...
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. Yeah, there's not a negative connotation to shadow here.
All right.
Yeah, it's just sort of like as the day gets later, the shadows get longer, which is kind of a beautiful image, really.
Yeah.
Yeah.
This idea that
Yeah, and sort of from a poetic level, as the sun is setting, the sun is coming lower. And if we're taking that big theme of the book of everything under the sun, it's as if less things are under the sun.
Yeah.
And as the sun sets, then
It's
yeah.
It's like the shadow gets infinitely long as everything under the sun is under you.
Yes, but also as the sun is dropping, your perspective is less and less about what is under the sun. Yeah. All right. Yeah, it's like the guy who wrote this was really smart. All right, verse 14. There is something else meaningless that occurs on earth. The righteous who get what the wicked deserve, and the wicked who get what the righteous deserve. This too, I say, is meaningless. When I read those words, they sound nihilistic, right? They sound like he's given up. Actually, I'm not sure that he is. What if we read the sentence this way? I've noticed that the righteous get what the wicked deserves, and I just don't think that matters. I've noticed that the wicked get what the righteous deserve, and I don't think that is the point. You should do what's righteous because it's what's better, even if you don't get the expected reward for it. So I commend the enjoyment of life. There we go. So I commend the enjoyment of life because there is nothing better for a person under the sun than to eat and drink and be merry. Right? Eat, drink, and be glad. Then joy will accompany them in their toil all the days of the life God has given them under the sun. Again, every time we focus on dissatisfaction and hopelessness, it's because he's excluded God from his worldview. Have you ever considered, well, let's start with this. During Jesus' earthly ministry, who are the folks that welcomed Jesus? And who are the people who rejected Jesus?
The desperate people accepted him very quickly.
Yes, people in need. Who are some of the people that rejected Jesus?
Self-righteous.
The people who were in power, the people who were self-righteous, the people who were doing better, right? I think this is a natural tendency. You know, I find that I am quicker to pray when I need God than when I don't feel the need as acutely. And this is a story of Israel over and over and over again. And I'm not telling you your story, but it might be similar. That when things are going easy, things are good, maybe you think less about God. The more control we can exert over our life, the more we feel in control. And you think about Solomon's life. He started on his knees. God, I can't handle this job. I will be unsuccessful unless you bless me. And by the time we get to this stage in life, he's all but forgotten God. He'll tell you how to get rich. He'll tell you how to deal with enemies. He has all the wisdom. Except he's forgotten that he depends on God wholly, right? And so we get this duality. As long as Solomon's life is about Solomon, it's a wreck. And when he stops and goes, but you know what? Actually, life is a gift from God. It's worth saying thanks for. And just don't overcomplicate it. You don't have to overanalyze it. You just say thank you for today. Thank you for my job. Thank you for the health to go out in the fields and do the work. Or thank you for the bread on my table.
This sort of conjures up that image of was it Mary and Martha? One was cleaning,
Uh-huh.
and the other was just sitting there in conversation. Kind of conjures up this idea of
Yeah.
she wasn't enjoying her toil.
Yeah, that's right. Martha was not enjoying her toil. She was like, Jesus, it's not fair that I'm doing all this service to you. Make Mary do some of it too.
Yeah.
It's like, well, if that's how you feel, then just sit down and spend some time with Jesus instead. What was interesting was last week, in our gospel reading, had a kind of the opposite story. They're in Capernaum. Jesus had preached in the synagogue, cast out a demon. And then they went back to Peter's mother's house, and she was sick. And he went and healed her. And she got up and started serving. And I don't think anybody asked her to. I mean, it didn't say anybody asked her to. Maybe they did, but I think she was just grateful and wanted to show her love and honor Jesus in response, you know? When I applied my mind to know wisdom and to observe the labor that is done on earth, people getting no sleep day or night, then I saw all that God has done. No one can comprehend what goes on under the sun. Despite all their efforts to search it out, no one can discover its meaning. Even if the wise claim they know, they can't really comprehend it. I think this stuff is so fascinating, right? Because, again, maybe it's just a facet of how we often handle the Bible in our modern day. But it's so easy to just take passages from Ecclesiastes and just say, well, that's that, right? So for you to read early in the book, Saul, there's nothing new under the sun. It all, whatever, and it doesn't mean anything, and I've figured it all out. And then you get farther in the book, and he's wrestling with the stuff, and he goes, nobody understands what's going on under the sun except God. All right, so let's put a bow on this. I want to wrap up. So let's put a bow on this real quick. What have we learned today? Yeah, there's some wisdom in there about how to obey the king, but I think there's also some implicit little barbs or little warnings that, like, you know what? Yes, handle the king with care, but also there's a time to stand up. There's a right way to stand up, and no, the king actually isn't. So he doesn't have the final word. And his wisdom will be limited, just like your wisdom is. Honor the real king. Oh, this would be a nice little aside, but it's a teaching that you might not be aware of. Before Saul was made king, did Israel have a king? Yeah. God was the king. God was their king. And judges were there as like the prime minister, but that's the way the Sinai covenant was structured, is that God was their king. And the reason they got Saul at all was people were like, yeah, but we want a different king. We want a king like everybody else has. To which God answered, no, you don't. Because he'll act like all the other kings. And they said, yes, that's what we want. And so he said, okay. And he gave them a king. But the only real, true, proper king of Israel is God himself. And of course, we see that kingship bestowed upon Christ in his, particularly in his ascension. Right? So now he sits on the throne in heaven, on the right side of the Father. All right, that's it for today. We'll pick up. We got through a whole chapter today. How about that? So we'll do chapter 9. Maybe the whole thing next week. We'll see how it goes. So we got church coming up in about 15 minutes, so stick around.